Hello, and welcome to the Politics of Gender, Episode 2. We're so excited to have you tuning in to the juiciest soap opera on TV right now, where we discuss man, woman, and...
Maybe we want to start over again.
No, we're going to push through. So, I opened my email inbox and found a whole chunk of requests for my dissertation, and this terrified me. Mostly because
Because your dissertation was obviously just perfect and flawless, and you're very excited to share that work with everyone.
It's more that if after releasing episode 1, someone was like, I want to read a dissertation, I cannot imagine a situation that would be like, and now I would like to read someone's dissertation. And so my presumption is, oh dear, people are actually going to be listening to this intently. And that's wonderful. Theoretically, it's what we hope for. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's like, okay, well, let's get down to business. So I just wanted to say, as we begin our adventure into the shaky realms of queer theory, gender theory, and the like, that this podcast, this work, will require patience. Mm-hmm. We are going through a whole host of competing theories, ideas, doctrines, and trying to bring people to a point where when we say things like sexual difference is the enabling difference for the intellectual operation in the human person, we don't just sound like we're insane people.
Yeah, it does sound pretty absurd on its face. I remember when you were proposing this, and then I went and read the dissertation, it took me a while to understand what it was that you were actually saying. Sure. I do think it's brilliant. I'm very excited about it.
I think part of it is it's like, well, how do you then bring people? How do you educate? How do you? And I don't really know. I don't know a good way to do it. So for us in discussions, we thought, okay, well, why don't we just sort of walk the path that we think we walked? So let's recollect our own steps towards both our frustrations with popular conceptions of gender on both sides of the argument, and our insights, like how did we get there? So in some ways, this is a chronological work. We're kind of remembering where we were and then trying to walk on our previously trodden path in the hopes that by walking with us, the conclusions, the locations we arrive at will seem natural as opposed to kind of an instant, like dropping you onto Normandy.
Yeah. and for me, my goal is just to help people walk through your dissertation and what you were writing and hopefully make sense of it.
Yeah. Although I think you're hedging. I think you're hedging because then I'm the only one who's to blame for anything absolutely ludicrous. It's like, I'm just here to explain the dissertation. Can't blame me.
I think I have a great role. That's exactly why I'm here, Marc.
So here we go. So what we want to talk about right now is Judith Butler. But I think it's fair to say that we should give some inkling of where we're going.
Yeah, just kind of a teaser of where the dissertation is headed in general.
Yeah, because I realize like we are going to very seriously tackle biological arguments. We're going to very seriously tackle the Thomistic arguments. We're going to very seriously tackle the communio school arguments. We're going to very seriously tackle not just that Catholic side, but then the kind of thinkers we're going to read right now on queer theory and gender theory side of things. Okay, so that's going to happen, but since it's going to be a lot of work, I just want to point to something in that for people maybe unfamiliar with the Catholic tradition or who might have a sense that the Catholic tradition and the kind of conservative tradition of a biological, procreative, exhaustive account of gender is sufficient.
Right.
So this is in John Paul II's Wednesday Audiences, Man and Woman. He created them is the title of this translation. Ruben assures me that the translation is awful. And so with that in mind, I presume some of the words are correct and that some of the meaning will come through here. I just want to read something so we can understand the distance and the difficulty that the Catholic tradition makes out of the limitation or reduction of sexual difference to its genuine procreative biological significance. To be clear, this is not, as you'll hear, it's not a destruction of this as real.
But it's more of a yes and this is true, but moving beyond that.
Yeah, and not just like moving beyond it, because what it is a transcending of the biological and the procreative. So I'll stop explaining it without reading it and just read it. Okay, so this is John Paul II. It's in the general audience of January 13th, 1982. Paragraph 4 and a little bit of... No, we'll just do 4. Okay. Yet the original and fundamental meaning of being a body, as also of being as a body, male and female, that is, precisely its spousal meaning, is united to the fact that man is created as a person and is called to a life in communion of persons. Marriage and procreation do not definitively determine the original and fundamental meaning of being a body, nor of being as a body, male and female. Marriage and procreation only give concrete reality to that meaning in the dimensions of history. The resurrection of the dead, indicates the closure of the historical dimension, and so it is that the words from Jesus, when they rise from the dead, they will take neither wife nor husband, not only express clearly what meaning the human body will not have in the future world, but allow us also to deduce that the spousal meaning of the body in the resurrection to the future life will perfectly correspond both to the fact that man as male-female is a person created in the image and likeness of God, and to the fact that this image is realized in the communion of persons.
One way of saying what John Paul is saying is that marriage and procreation is an authentic manifestation of the meaning of male and female, but that meaning moves beyond those manifestations, which are, he emphasizes that is being a historical reality, because there's going to be a future historical reality when we enter into the beatific vision, where that's not going to be a part of our glorified existence. And so does that render the meaning of male and female totally meaningless? We would say that's not the church's tradition.
Right. In fact, it's precisely that our biological and procreative experience, the very thing that we're trying to point to as being like, well, this is it. This is what gender means. This is what it means to be a man. This is what it means to be a woman. That this is in fact a sign of a greater reality than itself. So it's not to say a reality that isn't, I mean, this is where it can get kind of complicated, because I'm not saying that the sign is irrelevant or something like that.
Yeah.
Precisely as biological, as embodied, as procreative, as complementary, all of that which is real is revelation, is a sign of a greater mystery that we're trying to understand.
And so by limiting it to our vision of we can only determine the meaning of gender and of male and female only from this limited sphere of procreation and marriage, then we're discounting the words of Christ. We have no place for them. We can't really make sense of them. So that's one of the places where the frustration is, not with theology of the body, but we want to understand what that means.
Yeah, exactly. We want trying to more thoroughly explore the Catholic tradition, especially with reference to our patristic fathers, and trying to tie those kinds of very bold claims into the whole.
And I think what's exciting about that approach is that angle has a capacity of engaging with the questions about gender that are happening right now, and with queer theory in a way that we haven't been able to get that far. We've just run into roadblocks.
Right. I mean, you put it this way: if you have the conception that to be a man or to be a woman is something that results from this material biological operation in an exhaustive manner, so that's it. That's all it is. Then it makes sense why people have this great difficulty or this great pain in saying, like, well, look, I've got these variations and even perversions or difficulties within this material procreative reality. So if you just argued that you add up all of this anatomy and genetics and desires, and it equals man, then if I'm shifting all of the sort of parts, why do I not come up with a different whole? Why am I not in fact a woman, or in fact a third gender, or in fact something else? Granted, I don't think that this is a good argument, and I'm not saying every Catholic is making this argument at all, but it is an extremely common sense rejoinder. Yeah. Whereas once you say, look, all of those things that you just described, they're real. If there is variation, if there's difficulty, it's not as much of a like being cast out into an abyss, because you're saying these things are signative of the full transcendent meaning of man and woman, of sexual difference itself. And so that view, that which I just read in John Paul II, I think can handle variation and difficulty, not annul it, like recognize it as such. It is difficult, but not throw you into this position where you're like, well, I guess then I am excluded from the creation. I'm excluded from this male-female creation that was proclaimed to be at the beginning, and I am in fact some other thing, because it prioritizes the transcendent over its material, concrete existence in history. And I take comfort in that. I hope others would take comfort in that vision too.
Yeah, and I think with that, we can turn to the next task.
Yeah,
at hand.
Because we'll get to that stuff, I think, in really great detail. Just devote entire episodes. We can bring on people to debate opposing views, like Matt Walsh. I think he has a kind of biological sort of science argument. Matt,
yeah,
come on, buddy. Debate. Let's do it.
But if we're going to walk through your dissertation, yes, and walk through that,
the trodden path,
that angle, then the first thing that we wanted to do when we were thinking about the podcast is to actually get into queer theory,
yeah,
meaning Judith Butler,
yep,
gender trouble. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be doing a book club of sorts.
Yep.
So you are welcome to follow along.
Please do the reading.
It'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I have one extra copy, so if you email me in time, you can have mine.
It is also a free PDF online.
It is, yes.
Which is where I got mine.
So what do you want to talk about specifically today in Gender Trouble?
Today, I think we need to talk about it, but I think we also need to back up and talk about postmodernism first, because one of the difficulties in reading this text is that she's coming from a different language and a different worldview. Totally. And if you're not familiar with the language, everything is completely incoherent. Yeah, it really does not make sense. You have to struggle your way through.
Yeah.
But if you have the background of the basic principles that she's working with, and if you have the language that she's working with, totally, then suddenly the arguments start to become intelligible, and then you can actually engage with it.
So this is an old book that I've had for a while, and I read it at first in like the midst of my frustration. All I had was a biological sort of understanding, and I was like, all right, I'm going to read this obviously wrong person. And I have the most furious like notes on the side. I'm like, what are you talking about? Underline, makes no sense. Underline. Okay, so can an asteroid be a gender? Question mark. I mean, I was a little bit young. But it's funny because I've gone over this book again and again, and it's like, it's not that I think like, I figured out why she's right. Not quite the contrary. I think I figured out why she's wrong. Mm-hmm. But you're right. Like the language makes more sense. Having read other postmoderns and kind of understanding where she comes from a little bit.
Yeah. And I think understanding postmodernism really helps people to engage what's going on in this century in general with just academic conversations across the board.
Yeah.
I remember when I was first being taught about postmodernism, it was all right, and then here's where things just start to make no sense. There is no narrative, there is no pattern, there is no meaning. Everyone just kind of like dropped the ball. All right, explanation's done. It's over.
Yeah.
So in order to help us do that, I have a second book. This is called Cynical Theories. It's by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. Mm-hmm. So if I am remembering correctly, they consider themselves left-wing liberals. Mm-hmm. But they wrote a book breaking down postmodernism and how it ends up in critical theory, which is precisely what gender trouble is. That's what queer theory is. It's critical theory applied to gender. So towards the beginning of their book, they lay out two basic principles of postmodernism and then four major themes. And so I was thinking that we could just go through those.
Yeah.
And break it down for people a little bit. So there's two principles. One is a knowledge principle. The second is a political principle. And they describe the knowledge principle as being radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable and a commitment to cultural constructivism.
Totally. Yeah, you see this like from the very beginning of Butler. In the title itself, the idea is to trouble gender. So it has a few meanings, but one of the biggest one points to this knowledge principle. She's not so much about the business of saying, okay, she's absolutely not about the business of saying, I have found some true thing about gender or some authentic form of gender, which is being missed by all this male-female binary stuff. She is saying, I want to trouble what you say is your certainty about man being male and female.
She is about radical skepticism.
Totally.
Can we really know? So I think that's another helpful thing when understanding queer theory, or at least what's happening on the academic level, because that's very different than what's happening on the popular level. At least for Butler, she's not trying to say that this is what gender identity is. She is making no claim for herself, really.
Right.
She just asks a lot of questions, which a good portion of the text is just her asking questions.
It's one of the most frustrating parts of it, because if you go to the text and are trying to say, what do you think?
I couldn't figure that out till the end.
Yeah. So it is very much like a, we talked about enmity-based sort of modes, and this is definitely one. Like the idea is to break down strongholds of certainty and to question in order to reveal a kind of fundamental contingency about gender. So it's not so much that she wants anyone to think any particular thing as much as they wants them to sort of throw up their hands and say, like, well, I guess we could have constructed gender otherwise. I guess it could have been different, but it's not. I guess that this is actually an effective power.
I mean, it is an effective strategy. I mean, it's basically saying, so you think that this definition encompasses the whole. Well, what about this outlier here? And what about this outlier over here? If your definition is really sufficient, it should account for these outliers, and if it doesn't, then I'm troubling things.
Right.
But I do want to back up a little bit with the knowledge principle in general, and understand why postmodernism came to this conclusion in the first place. Because it is, you can think of it either as a reaction to modernism or really just a playing out of modern thinking, which begins with a very confident rationalism that we can know things, we can logic everything out. And then eventually with, this conversation is happening with many different thinkers, but Freud seems like a prominent one for me, because he offers the suggestion that perhaps our reason is a little bit unsteady. Because if we're being driven by these unconscious motives, I can't trust my reason in the same way. I have to start being skeptical about why I believe what I believe. And if you keep following this path, and if you are being honest about it, then you do run into radical skepticism. How is it that I can really know anything at all, until you get to this point at the end of the road where you don't think that you can come to objective knowledge? That's not a possibility.
Totally.
Because everyone is just, if all you are is stuck in your own head and your own perspective, there's no possibility of going outside of that as this casual observer and being able to see, okay, here's my perspective and here's the objective reality. Do these things line up? That's not a possibility for you. You're just stuck in your bubble. That's it.
Totally. Yeah, and I think this is why the turn in postmodernism becomes not so much the pursuit of truth as the revelation of the bubbles that you're talking about. So, to see the world as being not really a given, to move away from that presumption and to begin the presumption that the world is sort of what we'll make of it, and we make very different things of it according to our desires.
Yeah, if we can't actually get to know what's true about the world, all we're left with are the things that we create, which is why the other part of this knowledge principle is a commitment to cultural constructivism.
Right.
I can't get to know reality. All I know are my interpretations and my constructions of reality alongside other people. And so that's the only relevant discussion that's worth being had.
Yeah. And I think when you hear terms like radical skepticism and sort of a movement away from reality, you might think that this is a contrary movement to like the Catholic vision. But in many ways, I think Catholicism is actually much more sympathetic to this than to the kind of self-assured rationalism that you just described. And what I mean is, when you look at Thomas Aquinas, but the medieval tradition especially, there is this sense, a profound sense, of man being unable to know much at all.
Yeah, when you encounter reality, you're not encountering something that I can make sense of entirely, but you're touching a mystery, an infinite mystery.
Yeah, Aquinas says at some point, like, it is impossible for a man to know the essence of a single gnat. Now,
I love that.
it's great because, I don't know, just the gnat is
I've always wanted to know the essence of a gnat.
well,
But now I never will.
No, you never will. Aquinas' point is that, but this is where, so that sounds similar to something you might expect from Butler. Like, whereas Butler would say something like, well, because everything is just in a sort of material flux, and you are simply imposing upon it the forms that make your life livable. So because you need something, you desire something, because will is primary, you are going to impose intellectual forms on this material flux and say that I know what a gnat is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one revelation of, or I think that's one route to getting to this kind of skepticism, this radical unknowing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I think another way of putting it is both Catholicism and postmodernism acknowledge the mystery. I mean, they wouldn't put it in these terms,
right. No,
that there's infinite unknowing before us, but postmodernism takes the cynical route of, and therefore we can't know anything about it.
Whereas Catholicism takes the route of analogical participation. So what it means is, the gnat, anything, is a created gift from God, and as such, it cannot be known as God knows it in his creating of it. God is the one capable of, you might call it like the infinite analysis of any particular creation, but it's just another way of saying he loved it into existence. So it's most properly his. Now, we are in a position in which we can receive the gift of creation and participate in it, but always with this greater degree of unknowing about what the thing is to God, the only one who can know a thing as it is. So, I mean, another way to say this is we're like thrown into the world as a part of it. So we are a perspective on creation. We are a particular crafting of creation, of how it's going to appear. We are making choices in how we will describe things. It's like what a horse is. When we say we know what a horse is, we are in a large part talking about decisions that we have made for how we will historically use horses and deal with horses and understand them.
So in a way, Catholicism is able to say, yes, we are trapped in the bubble, but this isn't, it's really not that we are trapped. It's that we take it on faith that God has revealed himself and truth in creation in an intelligible way. And because we are like our creator, in the sense of having an intellect, we can actually encounter the truth of things, even if we can't encounter them in their fullness.
Yeah, we can't know them as God knows them, but we can know them in our own mode. And because of the relationship of ourselves to God, those modes can be constant. So we know like God. And it's marvelous. I think it's very, like, for me, the reason that then I have a sort of sympathy when I read this is because there is something like, initially, there's something like unto the experience of profound mystery, where if you've ever been, I'm sure everyone's had this experience, if you've ever been overwhelmed by like a visual or a conceptual experience where you realize there's an infinite depth that you cannot possibly penetrate, a reality that's given, that exceeds any of your categories, that exceeds any of your uses, that exceeds anything but your pure intellectual reception of it. Well, then I think you are having a positive experience of what I think the postmoderns are sort of taking as a alienated and awful experience. And this is one of my critiques of the kind of an aesthetic critique of the postmoderns, is that they're just like crying about what other people are rejoicing about. But for them, it's because they're getting rid of the theological questions. They've sort of done away with God in any particular way, and so they're not seeing this stuff as gift. They're not positing any kind of person who knows the thing intimately and invites you into his knowledge. They're just positing there's stuff, and I can't get over my own subjective construction of that stuff to appear in a certain way, and so I can't really communicate with my neighbors because we're not existing in a common truth, a common given. We are just in our own bubbles, and so the world becomes scary and violent, and everything that doesn't make sense is just further evidence of our own alienation in the world, that we don't really fit with the world. We're just...
Well, that perfectly moves into the second principle.
Grand.
Second postmodern principle is the political principle. This is the belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies which decide what can be known and how. So moving from what you were saying, Marc, you have this encounter of the mystery, but this is a terrifying reality because I can't actually know it. All I can know are my ideas of it and what culture has constructed of it. And so the only interactions that I'm really left with are interactions of power. And that's why you find postmoderns talking about power so much. This is why even language comes up as being so important, because everything becomes reduced to a power game or a language game.
Yeah, and just to slow down on that, like the reason is because if there's, I mean, we're speaking of power in a as the postmoderns might speak of it, which is with an intentionally negative, violent aspect.
Yes.
Whereas power within the Catholic tradition, precisely for the difference that we just explained, doesn't actually have any violence to it. It just means capacity, it means potency.
Yeah, well, really, it gives a potency to act in charity.
We'll get there.
Okay.
Well, probably we won't get there, but...
Well, it'll be in the book,
in
the Catholic social teaching book.
Oh, awesome. That's great. Yes, do buy that book if you're watching this years from now, and it's available. No, so the reason power has this sort of essentially violent aspect that you can kind of imagine, because if we're all only experiencing our own ideas of the world, if there's no common truth that we're given, and that becomes the basis for our constructing and our thinking being compared, saying like, oh, you think about it this way and I think about it this way, can be a opportunity for friendship insofar as you're living within a common world. But if it's really all that is, you only have your alienated, subjective, and experience that has no relation to the real as a given, then any supposed convincing of someone else of anything really just becomes a violent ordering of them to share to some extent your will, your construction, the way you make the world, right? So sometimes Butler, not to jump into it too quick, but sometimes Butler will say things like, like, my question is not so much to figure out what gender is as to ask who is served by having gender be deliberately tied to regular heterosexual relationships or something like that.
Yeah, she doesn't have an opportunity to investigate the real anymore because that's officially off the table. All you can investigate is power, where it's manifesting, why it's manifesting. That's it.
Totally.
Sweet. So those are our two postmodern principles, the knowledge and political principle. And then there's 4 major themes I think are helpful. I'll just read through them all and then we can go back through them. So it's number 1, the blurring of boundaries. 2, the power of language. 3, cultural relativism. And 4, the loss of the individual and the universal. So let's start with the blurring of boundaries. What is that talking about?
Oh, when you got two things and then someone says they're not that different. I'm just kidding. So, like, obviously with Butler, the blurring of boundaries it almost sounds like a sort of immediate critique of the whole project of queer theory. It's like you're blurring these boundaries.
Yeah, it's the method, I guess, to reveal the political principle, to reveal the power
Yes.
dynamics.
Yeah. So what it's not is, this is where people always get this wrong. What it's not is this argument that what is true is that the boundaries are blurred. So what I mean is sometimes you see this where someone, they want to identify as genderqueer or something like that. And then if you press them on why and what is it, they might give you some response like, well, gender isn't as fixed as people say it is. Gender is actually this sort of fluid phenomenon, and they'd go on to describe why, etc. Now, I'm not saying that's not a legitimate argument. What I am saying is that is not the argument that Butler, and really, it doesn't really fit within postmodernism.
No.
All that argument is for new boundaries.
Namely there's just multiple identities.
Now the boundary is fluidity. So now gender is associated with this. So that if I say that it's not fluid, if it's solid in some way, I have been wrong about an authentic truth about gender.
About some reality that's out there. But again, if we're being postmodern, we can't actually know that thing.
It's no more true that it's fluid than that it's solid.
So the blurring of boundaries is really just to show you that you can't get at the thing itself. You can't actually know what you're talking about. And so, I don't know,
it's more like
maybe the male-female thing, maybe that is right. You can't say that for sure. You can't really know. And I'm gonna show you that you can't know because of all these blurred boundaries.
Yeah, and when we talk about it in that sense, it's like that. It explains a little bit why. Well, it doesn't explain, but it shows you the context in which Butler will constantly point to exceptions, limit cases, because what she's going to say is, look, you guys have a materialist view. You said that because of these material facts, man is divided into male on this side and female on that side. I'm going to show you where that division point doesn't stand, whether it's through variations within genetics, alterations within anatomy, difference in desire, whatever line you draw, I'm going to show you where there's someone on the wrong, like someone that you think should be on one side and it's in fact on the other. Again, at least ostensibly, no metaphysics is being proposed here. No alternative truth is being proposed here. Now, maybe this is just an anticipation, but I don't think that the postmodern position in this regard is actually possible. So what I mean to say is you are always asserting something as true. And this is like a old kind of apologetic. Like, how can you say there's no truth because it must be true that there is no truth? But that's a good principle. Like there is
really, I think what you're saying is that ultimately the postmodern project cannot be done.
No, not at all.
You run in it so far that it turns back on itself.
Turns back on itself. You end up with a new metaphysics. You end up with a new anthropology. You have fixed boundaries of what the human person is, of what knowledge is, of who God is. You have your theology. You have your history. And this is really what I think if you read all of Judith Butler, so every single one of her books, this is what is happening. She is ostensibly saying, everyone else is wrong, and that's all I'm here to show is that, none of your categories have any kind of permanent existence. But what she's actually doing is constructing an alternative world that comes from the hand of man.
Yeah, which makes sense because it's actually very hard to do that, to just question and not assert anything.
Oh, totally. I mean, the fluidity
you have to
thing.
work really hard.
Well, the fluidity thing, I think already, like, you might have heard that fluidity argument and been like, no, but you are saying that gender is now something fluid. You can't just say, like, I'm pointing to how it's not solid, but I'm not asserting anything else about it. It's like, no, you are. And I think that that's the right impulse, is to always look for those places where it's like, what world are you building? Postmodernism is very vulnerable to this because it wants to say, well, because it just says, like, okay, we're all just constructing the world. It's all just will to power. We're all here, seeking our own interests and desires by having regimes of truth where we just kind of, for some individual satisfaction and purpose, we assert something to be true and then we enforce it. Okay, but if that's what the world is, then you're doing it too.
Right.
No one has no one has a justifying claim that comes from anything outside of their own will. And that includes this
Really,
book.
your claim is just, well, I don't like that.
Right. Yeah, it becomes individual self-satisfaction, which is essentially why we would associate this stuff with liberalism, in the sense that, well, we don't need to. Let's keep moving.
Yeah, well, we'll wait on that. The next one is the power of language, and I find this one really fascinating. And once you understand the connection between postmodernism and language, then just a number of things start to make sense in the cultural context. Why language has suddenly become so important, and it's because the postmodernists have realized that there really is a power in language, because your words change the way that you think about things.
They begin the way you think about things. I mean, my son asks me what something is, and I give him a word. And now he has a world that contains that as, I mean, he already had it in some sense, but now he has a human world that contains that as a universal. And I could have lied to him.
Yeah, exactly.
It's terrifying.
So the words that we choose are going to change the way we think, and so they're really a form of power. This is one of the ways that we culturally, or at least for postmoderns, how we culturally construct the world, because all we have access to is our own perspective,
Yeah.
which is really language. We're just talking about language, how we describe things and how we see things. So if you can control the language, if you can change the way that things are talked about, then you can gain power that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this,
because I think language, it draws your attention to things. There's like a dumb post that I think I've seen like floating around Facebook. Like, did you know that this tribe has 100 words for snow and we only have one?
mm-hmm.
But it's kind of a silly thing, but I do think it's helpful in seeing that when you have a language that has so many words for one reality, you start to be attentive to all the distinctions that are in that
Sure,
reality.
yeah.
It changes the way that you approach what snow is and how you see it, how you interact with it.
Yeah.
And so you have this dynamic interplaying between the world and language. So that's a dumb example, but I do think it helps.
Yeah, no, I think it shows the truth of it. And again, like in a similar way that the Catholic and the postmodern are more similar than the Catholic and the rationalist, because they're both standing before an abyss of unknowing. In a similar way, that turn to language is like the most Catholic thing I can think of. I mean, we worship the Word made flesh. Yeah. The entirety of our understanding of the history of salvation involves a word, the Word of God. Who, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to just like harp on the kind of poetic similarities, because there's obviously a vast difference, but the idea that in the Word you have expressed the cultural, personal constructing of reality is something shared by the traditions. The Catholic has no place thinking that there's some kind of inhuman one-to-one true word for true object, true sentence for true reality. It's like when, I mean, the point that I always turn to is like, why is it even a story within the creation of man that he names all the animals? Naming the construction of a pleasing world for God, the establishing of relationships, the saying that you shall be this kind of being to me, you shall be this thing to me, you shall, and I will call you this, I will relate to you through this medium.
Exactly. I think I've been thinking more about that particular instance and seeing language as a way of imaging God as creator. And so I think that the postmodernists are right, that we do really construct worlds through language. And I think that this is not something to be cynical about, because then you just reduce it and see it as just power and domination. But this is actually a way of imaging God, of being creators ourselves in the world that we've been given to till and to keep.
Yeah, and what you'll see is the kind of mark of difference between this turn to the word on both is that, again, the language use within the postmodern tradition is a violence.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, Judith Butler, in one of her essays on Kierkegaard, even says this about the book of Genesis, that there's a certain, she says that Adam seems to usurp the divine power when he names all these animals. And I think that's exactly what a postmodern would have to say, is that given that your subjective experience is all you have, your naming of it, and then through power, telling people that this is in fact the name that you and I are going to use, this becomes simply a violent imposition of meaning upon a meaningless cosmos.
Exactly.
And for your own sake. So there's some kind of reason, I suppose, for doing it. Um, and so when they look at the word, like when Butler looks at the words like male and female and man or woman, she's always asking, okay, who implements this? Who does it exclude? How is this utilized to negate other possibilities? But in the Catholic understanding of the use of the word, it doesn't have that violent aspect, because what man is created is precisely as the being that God waits to name the cosmos. It's by the gift of God, by a prior gift, that he names. So he names within the creation of God. And when Adam says, "This shall be a lion," or whatever, um, um, it's not a violent imposition of Adam's will over and against a cosmos that exceeds him.
It's almost
It's
as if
him being a shepherd as he was created to be. It's like God put the namer in the cosmos, so there's a naturalness to his naming. It's fitting that he builds the world and that he makes it particular and that he orders it into a pleasing construction.
that's what I was going to say as well. It's kind of weird because the postmodern critique almost has to view man as not being a part of creation,
Yeah,
and
totally.
naming as not being a natural thing.
Yeah.
But we find ourselves in the cosmos already. Naming is a cosmic reality already.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't do violence to the cosmos. It's
No.
a part of it.
Yeah.
But I think we need to move on to the
Sure.
last one. So the last one is the loss of the individual and the universal. So the loss of the universal is obvious already, because if we can't get to know actual realities, we can't make universal statements. We can't say, oh, this is a dog, this is a dog, this is a dog, this is a dog. That's really just a cultural construction. It's useful for me for understanding the world, but in no way does that mean that I understand what that thing really is.
Right. You look what all that really is. I mean, as much as you can say anything from the postmodern perspective, is this flux, is this material flux in which there are no universal intelligible forms. And this just is some ways in what it means to be. In some ways, this is what it means to just avoid the question of the creator, or to deny the existence of creation by just saying the kind of weird new atheist turn of just like, well, I'm pretty sure it's just always been there, or maybe it's going through a wormhole on repeat or something. And it's but that they don't realize is that what this takes away is any particular reason for intelligible universal forms. So the ability to say something like cats, dogs, because what is it except for the human intellect that looks at two material blobs and says, and these are both
The same.
yeah, because they're not as material. If all there is material, then the one thing that you can say, and you can barely even say it, is that they're not the same, because they're materially distinct. One's over there, one's over here.
Mm-hmm.
So it does get rid of the universal. Fair. Cool. Should know we're kind of collapsing materialism and postmodernism in some ways, which I think is largely fair.
Yeah. You can't be a postmodernist without being a materialist.
Yeah, the mark of being done with postmodernism is to start converting and believing in things like, which they do. So sometimes it gets confusing because like I think like people start to convert in their writings who we think of as they're the postmoderns, like someone like Foucault.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we're like, oh, well, you can be a postmodern and like believe in spirit or something, or it's like, well,
No, you can't. Well, one other point that's not written down in this book, but I think is helpful to make sense of the construction and language is an emphasis on narrative. Narrative is a really big deal for postmodern thinking, because narrative, the stories that we tell ourselves, is the way that we continue on the cultural construction. It's the way that we initiate other people into this like power grid hierarchy of how the world ought to be conceived. And this too, I think, is also exciting for a Catholic reading postmodernism, is because we've gone full circle again, because we've gone through the curve of dismissing narrative. We want objective reality. We want facts. And then it turns out that if you keep following that further, that really we're back into narratives again.
Yeah, because the narratives determine which facts appear and how they appear. Yeah, I mean, because, the Catholic lives within salvation history. We live within a story.
Mm-hmm.
The significance of things is not apart from history, contrary to what some people would like to believe about the world. So the narrative of creation, the fall, the redemption, and really every historical act that constitutes these larger movements, this is a determination of the cosmos into a particular shape. This is a determination of intelligible forms of life, into like what becomes intelligible to us, what's available to us. And from the Catholic perspective, this, properly speaking, is always a movement into deeper and deeper truth, because the narrative is actually the narrative of the church triumphant, like the world becoming more and more converted, more and more conformed to, so that the constructions that we're building in our own history is proper and fitting to the creation of God.
Relation with the reality that God created.
Right, exactly.
And we can do this in part because we have been gifted with an intellect, and so we can participate in God's knowledge. And we also do this through revelation. Mm-hmm. Sweet.
Yeah, and I think there's a reason why, for my own thought on gender, it's ultimately a turn to the biblical narrative. It's not just because I'm sure this will be a critique, is that like, well, you have all of these biological questions and existential problems, and then you're like, back to the book of Genesis. But I think that part of it being a response to postmodernism is to say, like, okay, you want to say that everything is just competing narratives instituted by various powers in order to construct the world?
Sure.
Fine. I've got a narrative for you. I've got a power for you. I've got a construction of the world for you. It's the church, and it wants to construct the world in a certain way. And it's a power, like it can do that. And it converts people like from their worlds and their language into itself. And it does this within a narrative that is actually arguing, well, not arguing, it's the narrative is the meaning of the cosmos. It's saying that they have the true narrative. Now, of course, I would then make the caveat that it really is true, and that it's not violent because it's perfectly in harmony with human flourishing and blah, blah, blah. But I'm just saying, on the face of it, what postmodernism does is it allows Catholicism to actually argue for itself. Because,
yeah, exactly.
All right, it's all narrative, so check out this narrative.
Yeah, I don't think that the postmodernists can actually make that full leap, but it does give Catholicism a stage on which to be an actual contender in the intellectual discourse.
The worst they can say to you is like, oh, but that's like a really violent, imposing narrative that I hate. And it's like, fine, yeah, yours is a violent, imposing one that I hate. We just happen to have, at this point in history, more de facto power to have more people believe this narrative than your narrative. Like, so
there is no argument against Catholicism except for I don't like it.
Sure.
I think.
Yeah.
When you're reducing it a lot.
Right. So then
I don't like that power dynamic.
Right. So then the evangelical work, or the work of trying to make Catholicism make sense, is to say, okay, given that, is there anything different about this narrative? Is there anything different about this power? Is there anything different about this language, this construction, this world building activity? And then we hope for, well, I hope for the grace of God to work on people in and through that discussion. But yeah, no, I do think it's much more familiar territory to the faithful Catholic than the world of like scientific objective debate on I don't know, some objective truth that's ahistorical and unrelated to salvation and revelation and all that. Is that fair? I mean, that's sort of how I feel. I'm not saying it's like
Yeah.
that was an emotion.
I mean, I've been moving in that direction, and it's been getting me really excited to see a growth of postmodern Christian thinkers who are entering into this idea that the world does not actually lay itself out in these objective facts that I can get to in an unbiased manner. This is actually impossible. And being able to engage with that and saying this is not something that has to lead you to utter despair, because that's one option. But this is how the world lays itself out. It does lay itself out in narrative and through value and through our own perspective, and it doesn't have to be a bad thing.
No, I don't think so. Okay, so that's roughly our understanding of postmodernism, which obviously is entirely inadequate compared to, just like everything else. It's a phenomenon that has an infinite abyss of unmeaning behind it that only God knows. But that helps us turn to Judith.
And I think possibly as far as we want to get, and the text is trying to understand what she's doing in the work.
Yeah, we can stick with the preface and then kind of move on from there. So one place where I'll just read that I have a little, there it is. That hopefully with that previous discussion we can understand, not necessarily agree with this as a good project to undertake, but we can understand
what she's actually doing.
Yeah, what she's up to. So she says, clearly this project does not propose to lay out within traditional philosophical terms an ontology of gender, whereby the meaning of being a woman or a man is elucidated within the terms of phenomenology. The presumption here, so that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The presumption here is that the being of gender is an effect, an object of a genealogical investigation that maps out the political parameters of its construction in the mode of ontology. So what's being said here is that the sense that gender is a substantive reality, that there are men and there are women, is an effect of language, of power. It's something achieved by man-made means, right? So we have ordered the world in such a way, we have violently gotten enough people to assent to beliefs, to live out certain habitual modes in order for it to appear as true that there are men and women, only men and women, an exclusive male-female binary.
Or maybe another way of looking at it too is that to move from the postmodern principles, if we can't really know reality as it is, then all we're left with is cultural constructions. And so we have this binary that's before us. And so the question is not what is really true about this thing. The question is, where's the power?
Yeah.
Who is it serving?
And she goes on in that way. So she says, to claim that gender is constructed is not to assert its illusoriness or artificiality, where those terms are understood to reside within a binary that counterposes the real and the authentic as oppositional. So she's doing something different with real. But the point is, when, in my experience of like how queer theory actually matriculates down to like the kind of high school level in which people are starting to identify as queer or identify as trans or otherwise sort of start to do this work, this liturgical work of troubling the male-female binary, they are often doing precisely what Butler says is not happening here.
Yeah, it's
namely,
not possible.
they are constructing it. They are, when they say gender is constructed, they are asserting its artificiality. So they're saying something like, my true experience of self is this. And this is as opposed to this artificial conception of man and woman as the only options or whatever. My real experience is so in that mode, like when I talk about like a naive queer theory, that mode is fundamentally Christian in the sense of it's truth seeking.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking as a given that it's in opposition to a lie that can be opposed by honesty, by virtue, and it seeks to attain a stability of identity.
It's looking for something real.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
claiming that this identity that I'm claiming is a real identity.
Mm-hmm.
But that's precisely what Butler says you can't do.
Right.
Now, it is useful for that to happen on like a cultural level for queer theorists, because those people doing those acts do in fact assist in troubling the gender binary.
Right, and that's well, they haven't been so bold as to say that they're using young people in this way, but it does have the effect that there's a disconnect between what's happening with young people who are saying, I identify as genderqueer, I identify as I use it as the only example, pansexual, because it can apply to sexual desire as well. There's this disconnect where, the queer theorists are kind of laughing. They're like, oh, you identify as, oh, you found some new substance. Oh, you have a noun. You have like an experience of being. They've already done away with all this. Like, it's all artifice. You're not. You haven't gotten in touch with any more authentic truth within the material flux. But what it does is when that proliferates, the goal is to, again, it's just an enmity-based goal. People who think that there is only male and female, who have this just simply dominant narrative, like a historically dominant narrative, are further troubled because they have to deal with people claiming that the binary is insufficient.
Yeah, I don't know if I would go that cynical. I don't know if there's a complete disconnect there. Like I'm not confident that there's like laughing behind the scenes, but
Yeah.
I think the goal that I'm picking up from Butler is that none of this matters. These cultural constructions are not true. I want to experience freedom and the power to construct my own reality, or to construct one that's more favorable to me. And so the young people who are a part of this project, it's going to benefit them too.
Right, because they're achieving their individual desire.
So even if they do think that I have achieved a real identity, as long as they're moved in such a place where they have the power to express and create their own cultural construction, I think the thought is no harm, no foul.
Sure. Yeah, and then by that more charitable read, it's more of a continuation of the like liberal project. Namely, I do want something positive, and that's the satisfaction of as most individuals' desires and wills as possible.
Yeah, but I do think it's important that what's going on in actual queer theory is not that these identities are real, but none of them are.
She says, as a genealogy of gender ontology, this inquiry seeks to understand the discursive production of the plausibility of that binary relation. So how did we produce the conditions in which it seemed plausible, apparently for so many years, that there were only males and females? And to suggest that certain cultural configurations of gender take the place of the real and consolidate and augment their hegemony through that felicitous self-naturalization. Yeah, so I mean, we don't need to keep on beating the same thing over the head, but it's the appearance of something as natural. She is saying is there is no nature, nothing comes as given. So how do we get things to appear as natural?
So I think it'd be helpful to use the terminology that she uses. So in the preface that I'm working with, she starts talking about the genealogical critique.
Yeah.
So her goal, again, to quote her, is to expose the categories of sex, gender, and desire as effects of power, of formations of power. So we've talked about all this before. And so in order to do that, she cites a form of critical inquiry that Foucault, reformulating Nietzsche, designates as genealogy. And so a genealogical critique is one that's trying to investigate power and power structures, power dynamics, how what power produced this dynamic in the first place, where's the power being moved towards, who is it serving. That is the project of gender trouble.
Yeah, totally. And I think that one of the great difficulties that the Catholic finds is that there is a sphere in which the postmoderns are correct, and it's hell. It's the sphere of sin. What I mean by that is like the violent imposition of meaning on people apart from any notion of creation does happen, in fact,
I see what you're saying.
within the God-given cosmos that Catholics are presuming. It's just that we see it as sin. So there is a way in which Butler, Foucault, Nietzsche can be right about a sinful society. So what someone like Andrew Jones would just say, they're right about the city of man, they're just wrong about the city of God, or something like that. So, and what's troublesome for me as a Catholic is I do think that we live under a regime of gender normativity where a certain view of gender has been artificially pushed as natural. And I do think it's the appropriate object of what you just called genealogical critique. Like, let's find out what man is producing here. What is the man-made production here? So in one way, just to sort of think about this, or to maybe get an insight into what I'm trying to argue, is that Catholics have always known that we have an odd, we usually express it just as we have an odd view of gender and sex and such. And it's most evident in our valuation of celibacy and virginity.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So what I mean is, like, we have if you just consider the narratives, we have a narrative, we have a particular language and a particular worldview that ends with us saying that the best thing that a person can do, the highest thing that a person can do with their sexual difference, which is a biological and procreative reality, is to not use it. Or rather, to enter into the state of what we would call the religious life. So virginity is a higher calling, it's a higher vocation, it's more proper to human flourishing and to the end of the human person than is marriage, procreation.
Yes. So
this is odd, I would say. And I think that, and I really, really want to get to the point in the podcast where we do a genealogical critique of the destruction of the religious life and of celibacy as an ideal, because I think that's actually what's happening here, is that we have made, well, let's put it this way. With the rise of Protestantism, the power shifts, there's a new narrative, and basically those forms of life are no longer understood as intelligible. So
there's no place for them.
No place for celibacy, no place for sanctified virginity, no place for understanding sexual difference as being orientated to something transcendent of procreation and marriage, something that renders procreation and marriage into a sign of something greater, which is what we just read at the beginning with Pope John Paul II. So when I read again, and I'm just trying to point to the sympathy here, because when Judith Butler says something like this, she says, of her genealogical critique, what continues to concern me most is the following kinds of questions. What will and will not constitute an intelligible life? How do presumptions about normative gender and sexuality determine in advance what will qualify as livable? In other words, how do normative gender presumptions work to delimit the field of description that we have for the human? For her, she's talking about the human person. And the reason I think there's a sympathy here is that a Catholic is actually raised to understand this, because we live in a world in which what constitutes an intelligible life for us is utterly at odds with what constitutes an intelligible life for the world.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that the very simple fact that for us, celibacy is the positive use of sexual difference towards an end that's even higher than marriage and procreation means that we are living within a narrative that is by others declared unlivable, unintelligible. It is unintelligible. If you try to explain it to people, you can see this. Like, this is, you need to convert in some way to understand why this would make any sense at all. And so when she talks about deliberate and violent constraints of what is intelligible or visible, like the construction of normative gender as a man-made artifice that doesn't have that kind of relation to the created given. On the one hand, we could say, oh, you're like being atheistic. On the other hand, I think we do in fact live in that world.
So what you're saying is that the world that we've been moving towards and culturally constructing has been like slowly reducing the meaning of human sexuality into the purely oriented towards procreation, to the point where something like the celibate life is useless and unintelligible, whereas that's not the tradition of the church.
Totally. Yeah, I think queer theory is a reaction against Protestantism, not Catholicism.
Fascinating.
So they'll look at this and say things like, we live in a heterosexual matrix that's all ordered towards reproduction. Like, the reason why this violent imposed narrative has become dominant and we all have to conform to the male-female binary through all these habitual actions and dresses and forms and blah, blah, that all of this is for the sake of reducing this, whatever it is, this meaning that they're not going to talk about much, but to procreation, for the sake of procreation. And then they'll have different interpretations of why. Like, for the Marxist thinkers, they'll say like, well, you need procreation for labor, you need labor for money, so this is for the capitalists, you know.
Yeah, and you can have multiple.
Yeah, but the point is, like, I just don't think the Catholic is in a position to say like, that's ridiculous, because it's like, no, you actually live in a world in which it has been constructed for something you cherish as the end and proper, like, most fulfilling use of sexual difference has been rendered unintelligible, not by a sort of conversion of hearts to the truth or a deeper, engagement with reality as it is given or anything like that, but by, I was going to say by Protestantism. That sounds mean, I suppose, but that's what I mean. Like, by an aggressive, powerful, rise of liberal states that render this sort of thing unthinkable.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean is there's a sympathy there, right? Like, I think that anyone who is thinking about the oddness of what Catholics think we should do with gender should probably have sympathy to the idea that the larger world, which we know doesn't understand us, is asserting something for ends that are not greater access into the truth and mystery of the cosmos.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there.
Oh, will we? Sorry, that was
was there anything else in the preface that you wanted to
go on? Yeah, I should probably.
I think we got to the heart of the preface, or at least we know from her what she's trying to do in the book, which is essential for moving forward. And we also know her background. Yeah. Because if you don't understand postmodernism, it really does not make sense. And you read it and you're like, she's asserting all these ridiculous things until you realize that she's actually not really asserting anything at all.
Yeah. Yeah. In some place she has this, she talks about how the very desire for someone to tell us something true and solid about gender is what produces it, which sounds kind of odd, but you can think of it in terms of like the world that we're given involves this sort of panicky sense about gender. Like, you can just, this just because of the reactions. Like, people don't have like,
people aren't calm.
there's someone that thinks she's a woman, and I think she's a man. Moving on. It's like existential. It's infuriating, or vice versa. Like, this is a person who I've told my experience of gender to, and they think that I'm like a sinner or whatever, and it's just immensely, um, it's immensely difficult. So I think what she seems to be saying is that, and I don't think she does a great job in saying, why is it that we long for solidity within gender norms, not just within our own age, but seemingly historically have looked for this. It seems like it's too much to say that there's no pattern of seeking out substantive gender as a reality. And,
I think in general that is the problem with the postmodern approach, is because humans are very strange. Because if the world is not a world of universals, why is it that we seek out patterns? Why is it that we move towards stability? Why is it that the way that we literally need to survive is by creating these constructions?
yeah, and they'll try to turn this on its head by saying, well, we just create them because we need them to survive. But
Then our question is, well, why?
why are we that kind of being that needs the creation of meaning in order to survive, if
At the
what
very
is supposed to be is meaningless?
At the very least, it's very mysterious that the universe would produce a creature that would need to create a false
You're right.
vision of its own reality in order to survive.
Yeah. So when she says like something like the anticipation of an authoritative disclosure of meanings is the means by which that authority is attributed and installed, it seems to be like it is a circle, right? She knows that, but it's that moment where I have this doubt about the project, because it's like, um, why not just say that we do long for an authoritative disclosure of meaning because um, because there is meaning, and because we really are saved by finding meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not arbitrary or violent or imposing, but is in fact who we are in the cosmos. She says, going on, I wonder whether we do not labor under a similar expectation concerning gender, that it operates as an interior essence that might be disclosed, an expectation that ends up producing the very phenomenon that it anticipates. So she's describing a longing to be identified as a gender, that longing that produces the very gender that it longs for because it wants it so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, like, I think there's a certain jump here, because it's the question that I always have is, well, why are we beings that long to find out who we are and long for this in terms of our sexual differentiation? Because no matter how distant the particular gender you identify with is from the male-female binary, it's only intelligible as what it is by that relation. Why is it that we long for, why are we so troubled by not having a solid authoritative sense of meaning when it comes to gender? Why do we produce it if it's so? Yeah. So in some ways, I'm just trying to cut the circle and say, I think it's just as reasonable to say that we are a people longing for it because that's who we are.
And that it's real.
Yeah. But that the postmodern project, since you have to discount those explanations, it's going to say, well, you're longing for it, and in longing for it, you're producing it as an object. Again, to just turn and just say, look, it's all man. It's all man. There's nothing given.
The world becomes an enclosed circle, and you can't get out, and it's just, it's not even an enclosed circle, it's descending spiral.
Yeah. Okay. Then we can finish.
Okay.
So next time we're going to keep going through Judith Butler here. Again, there's, as you can tell, many questions, and we hope to answer them all. We are taking responses as seriously as they deserve, which I think is very seriously. So if you have something you want us to address, please go ahead and comment or send us an email. But it might not come in an immediate order, because we're trying to, again, trod that path of understanding, going from where we were to where we arrived with you guys. So next time we're going to keep reading Butler. We're going to have a special emphasis on her, what's called like the theory of performativity, because that's sort of, I think, crucial to understanding both Butler, but then queer theory as a whole. And I think we should be able to do the book in 3 episodes. That's my sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. And then we'll move on from there. So I hope you read along with us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Bye.